Welcome once again, everyone, to the latest in our GC People Leader series. I'm down in Horsham, and this backdrop probably gives you some clues as to where we are. My guest today is Dr. Sabrina Cohen-Hatton, who's Chief Fire Officer with the West Sussex Fire and Rescue Service. Welcome, Sabrina. Good to have you with us for this session. Now, you've done the GC Index a while back, and we'll talk about your profile shortly and see how it weaves into your life, because you've had an eventful life, and I would encourage all of our listeners, our viewers, to Google you and find out about your eventful life and hear the stories, many inspiring stories. Our focus today is going to be you in this setting. Mm-hmm. As Chief Fire Officer, you have been successful, and you started your career at 20 years ago, I think?
Yeah, just over that now. I joined initially as a retained firefighter, a part-time firefighter, and then got a full-time position as a firefighter and worked my way through every rung in the ladder. So
this is family for you now, as well as work, presumably?
It absolutely is.
Yeah, lovely, yeah. And as you know, the purpose of this video today is to focus on your success and how you've been successful. Because you have, and this is on our screen now, you have a GC Index profile that's statistically unusual. About 5% of our population will have a game changer implementer profile. And typically we see game changer implementers as creative, practical problem solvers. They get stuff done in a creative way. And your profile also suggests that it's not your nature to overthink things or overanalyze things, or indeed to get bogged down in details. So it would be nice to get a sense from you of how's this approach worked for you in the fire service. Tell us a story.
I think for me it's really been about being practical, but also looking at how we can do things differently, looking at how we can innovate. And I ended up doing a PhD in neuroscience, really because I was interested in how we could reduce human error. I'd had an experience where someone very close to me, my husband, was involved in an incident where another firefighter had been severely burned, and there was a 1 in 4 chance that the person that was burned could have been him. And that experience was so profound for me, because I knew that I was about to become one of the people that we see every day who wake up to a bowl of cornflakes in complete normality, only for something to happen and their entire world gets turned upside down. And that feeling was so intense and so difficult that I never wanted anyone else to go through that. Unfortunately, for me at least, it wasn't him that was hurt, but it was our friend. And it was after that I felt quite torn, because it felt like, as much as I didn't want it to be my husband, it felt like I'd wished it on somebody else, and that's something that I found really difficult. Yeah. And that prompted me to look at what we could do to stop anybody else from going through that. And I didn't have a preconceived idea necessarily, but I knew that we could do something differently, we could do something better. And initially I thought maybe we could develop a better burns pack or something. But as I started looking into the problem, I found that the majority of injuries, across all industries actually, not just fire, but the majority of injuries, 80% in fact, happen as a result of human error. So it's not a problem with a piece of equipment or a flawed policy, but a human mistake. Yeah. Someone would make the wrong choice in the wrong place at the wrong time, and then someone would get hurt as a result. And so then I figured, well, perhaps if we can understand this human error a bit better, then maybe there's a way that we can reduce it. And so I left home at 15, school at 16, without any qualifications. I didn't have a background in psychology or neuroscience. And so I went back to the beginning and I did a psychology degree through night school, all while still juggling my day job, all the way through to a PhD.
Gosh, all triggered by that one
All triggered by that one incident.
Extraordinary.
Yeah.
Profound, yeah.
And the PhD really gave us more questions than answers. I had 7 years to complete a part-time PhD, and I did it in 3. I'd go in the lab at 5:30 in the morning,
Oh,
I'd
wow.
run my experiments, I'd go and I'd pull a full shift in the fire service, I'd go home, I'd put my newborn daughter to bed, because that was brilliant timing, and then I'd be back in the lab for the night shift until 1, 2 o'clock in the morning sometimes.
Just a touch of obsessionality in your nature, Sabrina, would you suggest?
Yes.
Okay.
And of course, because when I was doing my PhD, there was no one else in the lab at the same time. When my equipment would break, I would have to try and figure out a way to fix it. So, I think I wasn't sure by the end of it whether I'd done a PhD in neuroscience or engineering, quite frankly, but there's always a way. But that gave us the platform then to really start to look at human error in more depth in my context.
So you
of the
were
fire
beginning
service.
to see stuff in your data that was engaging, exciting.
Yes.
Giving you a pointer to, go on, carry on.
Yeah, well, my PhD focused on the neural mechanisms that sit behind the way that Pavlovian conditioning and instrumental conditioning can interact, and how that can bias our responses to certain things in the environment.
Yeah.
And I looked at it at a very micro level, but I was really interested in this phenomenon in the fire service and how our previous experiences, our previous learning, and the assumptions that we might make might trigger us to respond in a particular way. And in the fire service, the old decision model that we had was very linear. It assumed that people would make a decision in a normative way.
Yeah.
It assumed every decision maker was rational and every decision was made in rational circumstances.
You're sort of describing the strategists in our world
Yeah.
who work well in those worlds where that's possible, that approach. Yes.
But the truth is, at a fire, people are experiencing stress. It's high stress, it's highly dynamic, it's emotionally charged, and you don't have the kind of environment where you can weigh up all the possible options and select the right one. Actually, you're responding. You're making a very gut intuitive decision. And the first piece of research that we did looked at how people were making a decision in reality compared to how the theory suggested we should, or the policy suggested we should, and thereby how we should judge how effective a decision is afterwards. And we found that actually 80% of the time, another 80% here, but 80% of the time, firefighters were making very intuitive gut decisions and not those analytical ones.
Yes,
but
interesting. Yeah, go on.
When the policy says that the decisions that you're making are going to be analytical and rational, then you're judged by that after an event as well. And so, whilst a gut decision can be really effective in many ways, I'm certainly not against them, it can help us to navigate a very dynamically changing and fast-paced world very quickly. But if you're making a decision based on a piece of the jigsaw in front of you, it might be the right decision for that piece in isolation. But when you slot that piece of the jigsaw back in the big picture, you can have unintended consequences.
Yeah.
And so for me, getting underneath the skin of that and really understanding what we could do, how we could tweak that to really improve our chances of not making a mistake, that for me was the crux of this. And so we developed some techniques which we now call decision controls, and these techniques were designed to help people, once they'd made a decision, whether rationally or whether intuitively, it's irrelevant. Your point at which you have an intervention is when the decision is made, but before it's actioned. So at that point, we train our firefighters to run through a very rapid mental checklist of what's my goal, because then you're taking yourself away from that piece of the jigsaw that you're responding to and putting yourself back in the big picture. What's my goal? What do I expect to happen next? Because we found that during the research, our firefighters' situational awareness was quite low when they were making gut decisions in particular. They were in the here and now. They weren't thinking about what's going to come next. And then the final one is, how does the benefit outweigh the risk? And so when you're making a gut decision, you're not necessarily rationalising it. And actually just priming that can really help people to stand by a difficult decision more easily, because they've thought through the rationale of what it is that they're trying to achieve. And we tested those decision controls in a second piece of research. We had national decision trials. We had firefighters from all across the country coming together, and we tested half with the new against half with the old to see what would work best. And the ones using those new techniques, actually we found they were making They were making more goal-directed decisions. They were actually thinking about what it was they were trying to achieve. And their situational awareness was significantly higher as well. So we had some really positive results. We also tested the latency between the time when a decision was required and a decision was actioned, and compared it between the two groups. Because you can have the best theory in the world, it could be the best technique on paper, but if it's not practical, it wouldn't have been any use to us. Unfortunately, it didn't slow down the decision making at all, which was a real plus for us.
This is the stories. Just to hold that thought for a minute, because this feels like the coming together of quite an academic, linear approach that you were using in a more innovative, creative way. Did that strike you as you were going through that? That in order to influence change as a game changer, you had to mimic that academic process to be. I mean, am I overdoing that thought?
No, not at all. And in fact, there wasn't a great deal of evidence-based policy in fire and rescue. There wasn't a lot of academic work, particularly not in this area. But if we'd have focused too much on the academic and not enough on the practical, it wouldn't have had the credibility to float. And actually, one of the things that was...
And the other way around, I guess. But
absolutely. But one of the things that was most important in this, we were changing fundamentally the way that our firefighters make decisions. And the fire service is a very traditional environment, very traditional. So trying to do something differently challenges people, not just because they're invested in the status quo, but because they've taken that status quo and it's become part of their identity. So for an incident commander in the fire service, the way that they make decisions becomes inherently connected with how they see themselves. And if you try to challenge that, it's as bad as telling someone that they're a bad driver. It becomes something that's, you know, really internalised. So we had to think really carefully about how, if this is the right thing to do, how do we convince people it's the right thing to do so it actually has the impact that we know it could have. And so getting people involved, that engagement piece was so crucial in this. And those decision trials that we talked about, we had people from fire and rescue services all over the country coming down. And that meant they could see firsthand how effective this was, and they were part of it. And so then we had champions leaving our laboratory effectively and going back into the real world. And when we did the study, we did something kind of very laboratory based. We looked at the decision making in virtual reality, but then we put it on the incident ground at the Fire Service College, and then we put it in real life circumstances with real life fires in live burns, where in Hampshire, the Hampshire Fire and Rescue Service were brilliant with this, and they had a group of buildings where they had a contract, they were due for demolition, and they could go in and set fire to them. So it acted as a real fire. If something went wrong, the lights wouldn't come on and the fans wouldn't come on and everyone would come out. It was real. So we were able to really carefully mimic the same decision points that we could measure in really realistic circumstances. And again, that helped us to build the credibility. But once we had that, we then spent time putting on road shows and going to every fire and rescue service around the country, talking about the results and talking about the practical implications of this, and talking about how it was going to help our firefighters make their colleagues safer.
It is that mix of evidence-based plus pragmatism, isn't it, really?
Absolutely.
That seems to have helped with that process of influence.
Absolutely.
Just reading back at it, is it, in a way, it sounds as if you wanted firefighters to be, you're almost giving them permission to be instinctive, but in a slightly more sophisticated way, a more structured way. Is that how it seems to you?
It's absolutely right, because gut decisions are really effective, but they can also lead to unintended consequences. So what we wanted to do was create something that would build on those really effective neural pathways that we have, whether you're making an intuitive decision or a very, reflective decision, and build on that and maximise that, and putting the safeguards in place that will allow you to do that in a really effective way. And so for us, getting that real practicality at the bottom of this was essential. But also, we changed our national policy. And for me, that was really important, because if we're going to judge how effectively a fire commander is making a decision, then we need to judge it in a way that's going to reflect the way that their brain is working.
Yes, rather than encouraging some post hoc rationalisation of things that really didn't happen that way.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Yeah, crikey. I'm thinking COVID here, Sabrina. It's interesting, isn't it, watching politicians around the world some making instinctive decisions and some being very analytical and linear and waiting too long to make a decision. But I'm sure you see parallels to this approach to decision making.
Yeah, and I mean, actually, the COVID response, what COVID introduced was a crisis in an unprecedented scale with a huge degree of uncertainty.
Yeah.
And moving away from whoever was making a decision, because actually people in all sectors and in all walks of lives were making decisions, including about their own individual household, about what the future would look like and what they do for the best. And when you're in an environment that is so unusual and it's so novel in comparison to what you're used to, but also has such a huge degree of uncertainty, that can introduce a real capacity for decision inertia. Because you don't know what the future looks like. You have that uncertainty. And there are also huge accountability anxieties as well. If I do this, what are the ramifications? How will I feel about myself if this ramification plays out, or that ramification plays out, or that one
Hang on,
plays
let me put the spotlight back on you, because this living with uncertainty theme has been part of your life. But again, if we look at game changer implementers, they're folk typically who are prepared to try stuff, try it and see what happens. And it's almost their way of managing uncertainty rather than analyse and in a more systematic way. Is this approach to try stuff and see, is that you?
Absolutely, because I think sometimes you can take 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but you've still taken a step forward. And if you'd have waited to have the perfect path laid out in front of you, then you probably wouldn't have stepped out at all. Or by the time it's laid, the world would have changed so dramatically that it's irrelevant. So, for example, with this research, we started off, we didn't have any pre-prepared mandate for it, we didn't have any funding for it. It was an idea that we had, and we convinced people that it would be a good idea. And then we convinced other people that it would be a good idea, so to bring in the resources that we needed. And then we convinced people to get involved voluntarily because it would be a good idea. And so what you ended up with then is a coalition of willing people that believed in something, that could see how it could benefit their world if it came into play. And that helped us to get something incredible out of just a seed of an idea.
With your game changer implementer profile is very evident. And there are suggestions that other areas of activity you don't have the same energy for. Who do you look for to have around you to complement you in your leadership role? Who are those folk that you think, they're different to me, but I need them?
I think that leadership, it's really easy to look at leadership as something you do as an individual, but I think that's not doing leadership enough credit. It's a team approach. If you want to lead, then you also need to inspire people to follow you. So actually, leadership is a relationship. And so I try to think about what it is that we're trying to achieve, and then think about what are the qualities that we need to get us there. And so it's really important to me to have people around me that compensate for the qualities that I don't have, and that I can compensate for the qualities that they don't have. And then we can work together as a team. You know, the way that I look at it, you would never want a toolbox that was full of 10 mil spanners, because unless all you've got is 10 mil nuts in the world, then you're not actually going to be that useful. So that balance of different qualities and different skills, and crucially different perspectives, is really important. So I like to surround myself with people that don't think like me. I like to surround myself with people that don't agree with me, or that are happy to challenge, because I know that if we can have that really healthy, constructive debate, then actually we'll more likely get something practical that will move us forward, that will survive the inevitable debate and attacks from elsewhere. But I don't love spending time on the detail. I will when I need to. So for example, with my research, with my particularly with the neuroscience element, really delving down into that detail was important. So I can do it, and I'm happy to do it, but it's not where I love because it stops me from moving.
Yeah, and it still sounds like pragmatism. Actually, it was giving you answers, wasn't it, to that burning question that you had about fixing something that was a problem, needed fixing. Yeah. Listen, that was a great story, and it's time for us to draw to a close. As we do, this is just me being nosy. How does this manifest itself in life outside of work, this creative, practical problem solver?
It means I get harebrained ideas and I'm obsessed with seeing them through.
Really? Just give us, if one or two come to mind, let's end on this note.
My goodness me. Well, I think that, the PhD and the research was definitely one, and that came from, and that was years in the making, even years before the PhD, from the thought and trying to drive something through to doing a degree, then all the way through to PhD, and then the research that came afterwards, and then the application. We're talking decades in the making for this work. But there are other things. So I really thought that the work that we did, the research that we did, was applicable in a much broader.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, in all walks of life. And so I wrote a book.
Oh, yes.
Yes, so I wrote a book about that, and that was a labour of love. But again, from start to finish, that was just 9 months of writing, because it's that kind of real focus on, this is where I need to be, this is what outcome I need, and so this is what I've got to do to get there. So every spare moment, every waking moment is kind of spent and really focused on doing that. And so I think there are other examples where I'll have an idea and people will think, really?
Of course.
Are you sure you want to do that?
From?
Yeah, but I'll see it all the way through. And my poor long-suffering husband now, whereas I think in the beginning of our relationship I'd say something and he'd be like, oh, okay, that could be interesting, but are you sure? Now he's like, yes, dear, I'll be here and I'll make you some tea so you can come home to a cuppa.
I'll strap on the seatbelt. We'll go with it.
Yeah. But I am obsessive about seeing something through. That's really important to me. But equally, if something's not working or it's broken or it's not going to get where we're anticipating it should, I will really happily change.
That's interesting, isn't it? That's exactly that implementer bit of, this has to work, and if it's not going to work, let's move on. Interesting. I
like to think of it more like fire enveloping something and going around, rather than earth being completely solid and trying to move everything out of its way.
Listen, there are many people who will watch this who will think, I get that, that's me too. So that's wonderfully affirming. Thank you for doing that. And thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
For supporting us with our community.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.